My girlfriend told me she was pregnant and that I had to buy them a house. And at first, I believed her completely because we'd been through this before. But what I didn't realize was that the first pregnancy, the real one that broke me, had taught her exactly how to manipulate me the second time around. I need to tell you about that first pregnancy because without understanding what happened back then, nothing that came later makes any sense. And honestly, I should have seen it coming the moment she said those words again. Emily and I had been together for almost 4 years when the first pregnancy happened, and up until that point, everything felt normal, maybe even good. The kind of relationship where you're comfortable enough to talk about the future, but not in any rush to get there. She had always been very clear about one thing, though. She didn't want kids. Not now, not in 5 years, maybe not ever, and she made sure I knew that from the beginning. She was on birth control, took it religiously every morning with her coffee, and whenever the topic of children came up with friends or family, she'd smile politely and say something like, "We're just not there yet," but I knew what she really meant. The problem was, I did want kids, I always had, and I thought maybe over time she'd change her mind, or at least be open to the conversation, but I never pushed it because I loved her and I figured we had time. Then one day in late September, Emily came home from work looking pale. She barely said hello, just walked straight to the bathroom and closed the door, and when she came out 20 minutes later, she was holding a pregnancy test. She looked at me with this expression I'd never seen before, somewhere between shock and fear, and she said, "I'm pregnant," and I swear to God my brain just stopped working for a second. My first reaction was pure joy. I mean the kind of happiness that makes your chest feel like it's going to explode. I immediately started thinking about everything, cribs, baby names, how we tell our families, and I was already mentally rearranging my entire life to make room for this child. I asked her how it happened, and she said she'd forgotten to take her pill a couple of times the month before. She'd been stressed at work and it just slipped her mind, and honestly, I didn't care how it happened. I was just thrilled that it did. I told her we should get married, that I wanted to do this right, that we should start looking at houses because our apartment was way too small for a baby. And I remember saying we were going to be amazing parents. I kept repeating it like I was trying to convince both of us it was real. But Emily didn't react the way I expected. She wasn't crying tears of joy or laughing or even smiling. She just looked exhausted and said, "I need some time to process this." And then she went to bed at like 7 in the evening. Over the next few days, I was on cloud 9. I started researching baby stuff, looking at real estate listings online, even called my mom to tell her she was going to be a grandmother. But Emily was completely different. She was distant, quiet, almost like she was moving through the apartment as a ghost. And whenever I tried to talk to her about the pregnancy, she'd give me one-word answers or change the subject. I thought maybe she was just scared, that this was a normal reaction to an unplanned pregnancy. So I tried to be supportive and give her space. But deep down, I was starting to feel this weird tension between us that I couldn't explain. Then about 2 weeks after we found out, Emily started bleeding. At first, she thought it was normal, something about spotting being common in early pregnancy, but it got worse throughout the day, and by that night we were in the emergency room. The doctor did an ultrasound, and I'll never forget the look on his face when he turned the screen away from us. He said very gently, "I'm sorry, but there's no heartbeat." And just like that, it was over. Emily had a miscarriage. We lost the baby, and I felt like someone had reached into my chest and ripped out everything that mattered. I cried in that hospital room. I'm not ashamed to say it. I cried harder than I'd cried about anything in my entire life. And when I looked over at Emily, she was crying too, but something about it felt off, like she was crying because she was supposed to, not because she was actually devastated the way I was. We went home that night in complete silence, and for the next few weeks, I was an absolute mess. I couldn't focus at work. I barely ate. I kept thinking about all the things that would never happen now, the first steps, the first words, teaching my kid to ride a bike. All of it just gone before it even started. Emily seemed sad too, but not broken, not the way I was. And after about a month, she started acting completely normal again, like nothing had ever happened, like we hadn't just lost a child. I brought up the idea of trying again someday, and she shut it down immediately. She said, "Mark, I don't think I'm ready for that." And when I asked when she might be ready, she just shrugged and changed the subject. We had talked about getting married before the pregnancy, nothing concrete, but it was definitely in the air. And after the miscarriage, I thought maybe we'd move forward with that as a way to heal together. But Emily said she wanted to wait, that we both needed time to process what happened, and I agreed because I was too emotionally destroyed to argue about anything. What I didn't realize at the time, what I couldn't have possibly known, was that while I was grieving the loss of a child I had already loved, Emily was watching me very carefully, studying every single thing I did. She saw how quickly I'd been willing to change my entire life, how eager I was to buy a house, to get married, to give her everything she could possibly need, all because of a baby. And somewhere in her mind, during those weeks when I was falling apart, she started to understand something important. She realized that a pregnancy, real or not, was the key to getting exactly what she wanted from me, and that if she ever needed to use that key again, she'd know exactly how to turn it. I spent months trying to rebuild myself after that loss, going to therapy, talking to friends, doing everything I could to move forward and find some kind of peace. But Emily moved forward a lot faster than I did, almost like she'd never really been affected at all, and now I understand why. Looking back on everything that happened after, I finally get it, because while I was mourning a child and trying to process genuine grief, she was taking notes, planning her next move, figuring out how to use my pain against me. And the worst part is, I never saw it coming until it was almost too late, until she'd nearly gotten everything she wanted, and I'd nearly lost everything that mattered. About 7 months after the miscarriage, just when I was finally starting to feel like myself again, Emily came to me with news that made my heart stop in the best and worst way possible. She told me she was pregnant again, and this time, her face looked different, not scared or distant like before, but serious, almost determined, like she'd made peace with something big. My first instinct was to be cautious because I couldn't survive going through that pain again. But when I looked into her eyes and saw what I thought were tears of genuine emotion, all my defenses crumbled, and I let myself believe that maybe, just maybe, we were getting a second chance at this. I asked her if she was sure, and she nodded, said she'd taken 3 tests over the past week and they were all positive, and when I asked how it happened, she told me she'd been thinking a lot about what we lost and realized she didn't want to live with regret. So she'd stopped taking her birth control a few months ago without telling me because she wanted it to be a surprise. I should have questioned that right there. I should have asked why she'd keep something that huge from me, especially after everything we'd been through. But instead I just hugged her and told her everything was going to be different this time, that we were going to be okay, that this was our second chance. The next few days were honestly beautiful. We told our families together, and everyone was thrilled but also nervous given what happened before. And Emily seemed more engaged this time, more present, like she was actually excited about becoming a mother instead of terrified. But then things started to shift in a way I didn't expect. She began talking about the wedding, not in a dreamy future planning kind of way, but with real urgency, like it needed to happen immediately, like we were running out of time. She kept saying a baby needs stability and that she needed to know we were truly committed to each other. And when I agreed that we should start planning, she pushed for a date within the next 2 months, which felt insanely rushed, but I figured she was just nesting, or whatever they call it when pregnant women get anxious about the future. Then came the conversation about the house, and this is where I started to feel something in my gut that I tried to ignore because I wanted so badly for everything to be real, for this to be our happy ending. We were sitting at the kitchen table one night looking at listings online, and Emily kept pointing out houses that were way above our budget, places with 4 bedrooms and big yards in expensive neighborhoods. And when I mentioned that we couldn't afford something like that right now, she got quiet for a minute and then suggested we use my savings for the down payment. I told her my savings were supposed to be for both of us, for our future together, and she smiled and said it was exactly for our future, but then she added something that made my stomach turn in a way I couldn't quite explain. She said the house should be in her name though, just to be safe, and when I asked her what she meant by safe, she explained that if something happened to me, God forbid, she wanted to make sure she and the baby would be protected, that she'd have security no matter what happened between us. I sat there trying to process what she was saying because on the surface it almost made sense. People plan for worst-case scenarios all the time, but something about it felt wrong, like she was planning for a future where I wasn't even part of the picture, where I was just a wallet that might disappear. I told her I needed to think about it, and she didn't push, just kissed me on the cheek and said to take my time, but that we needed to decide soon since she was already 8 weeks along, and we should get moving on things. Over the next couple of weeks, Emily brought up the house thing constantly, always framing it as protection for her and the baby, and she started adding more conditions, like wanting the wedding to happen before we closed on the house, and wanting me to add her to my bank accounts just in case of emergencies, just so she could access money if something happened to me. I started to feel this weird pressure, like I was being backed into a corner, like every conversation was another step towards some trap I couldn't see yet. But every time I tried to voice my concerns, she'd get emotional and say she thought I wanted this family, or that after what we went through she just needed to feel secure, and I'd immediately feel guilty for even questioning her motives. The turning point came about 3 weeks after she told me about the pregnancy. I came home early from work one day because I'd forgotten my laptop on the kitchen counter, and when I walked in, Emily was on the phone in our bedroom with the door halfway closed, and I could hear her voice carrying down the hallway. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop, I swear, but I heard my name and something in her tone made me stop in the hallway, and what I heard next made my blood run cold. She was talking to her friend Rachel, and I heard her say that I had been ready to give her everything last time. The house, the ring, all of it. And then we lost the baby, and everything just stopped. All the plans disappeared. There was a pause while Rachel said something I couldn't hear, and then Emily laughed, actually laughed, and said, "This time I'm not leaving anything to chance. Once the house is in my name and we're married, I'll figure out the rest." I stood there frozen in the hallway, my heart pounding, trying to understand what I was hearing, trying to make it make sense in some other way. But then Emily said the words that destroyed everything I thought I knew about her. She told Rachel that I would never know the truth, and even if things didn't work out between us down the line, at least she'd have the house. At least she'd have something to show for all of this. I quietly backed out of the apartment, walked to my car, sat there for almost an hour, and tried to make sense of what I'd just heard, tried to find some explanation that didn't mean what I thought it meant. The pieces started coming together in the worst possible way. Her sudden change of heart about having kids after years of being adamant she didn't want them, the urgency about the wedding and the house, the insistence that everything be in her name, and most horrifyingly, the fact that she'd never actually shown me any proof of this pregnancy beyond her word. I realized sitting in that car that I'd never seen a doctor's appointment confirmation, never been invited to an ultrasound, never even seen the positive pregnancy test she claimed to have taken. I just believed her, because why wouldn't I? After everything we'd been through, why would she lie about something like this? That night I came home and acted completely normal. I kissed her hello, asked about her day, made dinner, and didn't mention anything about what I'd heard, because I needed to know for sure before I did anything. I needed proof that I wasn't losing my mind. Over the next few days, I started paying closer attention to things I'd been ignoring before, like how Emily wasn't experiencing any morning sickness even though she claimed to be almost 12 weeks along. How she was still drinking coffee every single morning when she'd given it up completely during the first pregnancy because it made her nauseous. How her body hadn't changed at all, not even a little bit. I suggested we go to her next doctor's appointment together, and she made an excuse about how her doctor was completely booked for weeks and she'd have to reschedule anyway. And when I offered to call the office myself and add myself to the appointment, she got defensive and said I was being controlling, that she needed space to handle her own medical care. I knew then, with absolute certainty, that there was no baby, that Emily had watched how desperate I'd been during the first pregnancy, how willing I was to give her everything she wanted, and she'd decided to weaponize that against me. She'd watched me grieve, studied every single one of my reactions, and crafted a detailed plan to get exactly what she wanted: a house in her name, financial security, a wedding, all on her terms, all using my money, with zero intention of actually having a child. The worst part wasn't even the lie itself. It was realizing that the person I'd loved and trusted for 4 years had looked at my pain, my genuine devastation over losing a child, and thought, this is how I get what I want. This is the key to everything. I felt sick. I felt betrayed. But most of all, I felt stupid for not seeing it sooner, for being so desperate to believe in the fairy tale, so eager for a second chance at fatherhood, that I'd ignored every single red flag waving right in front of my face. Now I had a choice to make. I could confront her immediately and watch her scramble for excuses, or I could play along, let her think her plan was working perfectly, and see exactly how far she was willing to take this lie, how deep the betrayal actually went, and honestly, after what she'd done, after how she'd weaponized the worst moment of my life, I wanted to see just how far she'd go before I pulled the rug out from under her. I made the decision to let Emily believe her plan was working perfectly, and for the next 2 weeks, I played the role of excited future father better than I ever had before, asking about baby names, showing her house listings I'd found, even suggesting we start shopping for nursery furniture on the weekends, and the whole time I watched her lie straight to my face with a smile. The thing about knowing the truth is that it changes how you see absolutely everything. Every time Emily put her hand on her stomach and talked about how the baby was growing, every time she made up some elaborate story about morning sickness or weird food cravings, I could see right through it, and what shocked me most wasn't just that she was lying, but how good she was at it, how easily and naturally the lies came to her like she'd been practicing. I started documenting everything in secret. I kept detailed notes on my phone about every conversation, every time she refused to let me come to a doctor's appointment, every single inconsistency in her story, because I knew that when this finally came to a head, I needed to have concrete proof that I wasn't crazy, that this wasn't just paranoia or cold feet about commitment. One night about a week before we were supposed to meet with Daniel, the real estate agent Emily had found, she brought up the paperwork for the house. She said we needed to get pre-approved for a mortgage and that she'd already filled out most of the application with her information to save us time. She showed me the papers and I noticed immediately that she'd listed herself as the sole owner on the title and me as a co-borrower on the mortgage, which meant that legally, I'd be responsible for paying for a house I wouldn't actually own. And when I pointed this out, she had an explanation ready about how it was better for tax purposes or some other vague financial reason she couldn't quite explain. I told her it sounded fine and that I'd sign whatever she needed. And the relief that washed over her face was almost sad, like she'd expected me to fight her on it, but was absolutely thrilled that I was still playing along like nothing was wrong. The truth is, I had zero intention of signing anything, but I wanted to see how far she'd push this before I pulled the rug out from under her. I wanted to watch her walk right up to the finish line before I showed her it was never real. A few days later, Emily suggested we meet with Daniel to discuss our options and timeline, and I agreed immediately, even offered to take the afternoon off work so we could do it together, which seemed to make her genuinely happy, like everything was finally falling into place. The morning of the meeting, I went to my bank and spoke with someone about my accounts. I didn't move any money or close anything because I didn't want to tip her off, but I wanted to understand exactly what would happen if Emily somehow got access to my savings. And the banker assured me that without my explicit written consent and signature, she couldn't touch a single dollar, which gave me some much-needed peace of mind. When I got to Daniel's office that afternoon, Emily was already there, sitting in the waiting area with a folder full of printouts and notes and paint samples, and she looked more excited than I'd seen her in months, like this was the moment she'd been working toward for so long, like she was about to win. We sat down with Daniel, and he started going through the whole process, talking about down payments and interest rates and closing costs, and Emily kept nodding along like she understood everything perfectly, occasionally squeezing my hand like we were in this together, like we were a real team. Then Daniel asked about our timeline, and Emily said we wanted to move as fast as possible, that we were expecting a baby and needed to be settled before the due date. And I watched Daniel's face light up with congratulations while I sat there feeling absolutely nothing but cold clarity. After about 30 minutes of this, Daniel excused himself to print some documents in the back office. And the moment he left the room, I turned to Emily and said I needed to show her something before we went any further with this. She looked confused but curious, maybe a little nervous, and I pulled out my phone. But instead of the voice recording she might have expected, I opened up a folder of screenshots I'd taken over the past week. See, after I overheard that phone call with Rachel, I'd waited for Emily to leave the apartment, and I'd gone through her laptop that she always left open on the kitchen table, and I'd found everything. The messages between her and Rachel where they planned this whole thing out, the conversations about how to handle me, how to make sure I stayed convinced. Even a draft text she'd never sent where she joked about how easy it was to manipulate someone who actually wanted to be a father. I'd screenshot everything, backed it up to my cloud, and now I showed it all to her, slowly scrolling through message after message while her face went from confused to pale to absolutely horrified. The color drained from Emily's face so fast I thought she might actually pass out right there in Daniel's office. And for a solid 10 seconds, she just sat there in complete silence, staring at my phone like it was a weapon pointed directly at her chest, like her whole world was collapsing. Then she tried to speak, opened her mouth and closed it again, and finally managed to say that I was taking it out of context, that Rachel had been giving her bad advice, and she was just venting to a friend, that she didn't mean any of it the way it looked in text form. I let her talk, let her stumble through excuse after excuse, watching her try to reconstruct some version of reality where she wasn't the villain, and when she finally stopped, I asked her one simple question that I already knew the answer to. I asked if she was actually pregnant. She looked at me with these wide, desperate eyes and said of course she was, that she couldn't believe I'd even ask her that. How dare I question something so serious? And I told her to prove it. Right now. Call her doctor and have them send over the ultrasound photos. Show me any medical documentation at all. Anything that proved this was real. Emily's face crumbled and she started crying. Real tears this time. And she said, I did it because you wouldn't commit otherwise, Mark. I was scared of losing everything, and I realized that in her mind, she'd actually justified this to herself, convinced herself that manipulating me was somehow necessary or reasonable, that lying about a pregnancy was just a tool to get what she deserved. I stood up and told Daniel, who had just walked back and looking extremely uncomfortable and confused, that we wouldn't be needing his services after all, that there had been a misunderstanding and we needed to leave. And Emily grabbed my arm hard and begged me not to do this, not to throw away our future over what she called a misunderstanding. I looked at her, really looked at this person I'd spent 4 years of my life with, this person I'd been ready to marry and build a family with. And I said, I lost a child. Emily, I mourned a baby that I loved, and you saw that as an opportunity. She tried to argue, said she'd lost the baby too, so her grief was just as real as mine. But we both knew that wasn't true. Her grief had lasted maybe a month while mine had nearly destroyed me for half a year. I walked out of that office, and Emily followed me into the parking lot, still crying, still trying to convince me that we could work through this, that couples therapy could fix it, that she'd do anything to make it right if I'd just give her another chance. I got in my car, and she stood at the driver's side window saying I was throwing away our future, that everything she'd done was because she loved me and wanted security for us. And I rolled down the window just enough to tell her that there was no future anymore, not for us, that I refused to build a life on top of a lie this massive and calculated. She asked where I was going, and I told her I was going home to pack her things, that she had until the end of the week to find somewhere else to stay. And the look on her face was pure shock, like she'd genuinely believed that even after being caught red-handed, I'd somehow forgive her and we'd move forward like nothing happened. Over the next few days, Emily tried absolutely everything. She called and texted constantly, showed up at my apartment at weird hours of the night, even got her mom involved, who called to tell me I was being too harsh and that young couples make mistakes and I should be more forgiving, but I didn't budge an inch. The truth is, I could have maybe forgiven a lot of things. People lie, people make mistakes, but not this, never this. Not using the worst pain of my life as a blueprint for manipulation, not faking a pregnancy and planning to fake another miscarriage just to secure a house and a wedding ring. About a week after everything fell apart, I got a text from Rachel, Emily's friend, apologizing for her part in it, and saying she'd told Emily from the very beginning that the plan was wrong and would blow up in her face, but that Emily had insisted I'd never find out, that I was too trusting and too desperate to be a father to ever question her. I didn't respond because, honestly, I didn't care anymore about apologies or explanations. My anger had faded into something colder and clearer, just a deep understanding that I'd dodged something absolutely catastrophic. I spent the next few months rebuilding my life for the second time in a year, but this time it was different. I wasn't mourning a child. I was mourning the person I'd thought Emily was, and accepting that she'd never actually existed, that the woman I'd loved had always been partially a fiction. Looking back now, I'm genuinely grateful I overheard that phone call with Rachel. Grateful I went through her messages. Grateful I didn't sign those papers. Because if I hadn't, I'd probably be sitting in a house I didn't own, married to someone who saw me as nothing more than a means to an end, wondering why I felt so empty and trapped. And the scariest part is, I would have never known why. I would have spent years trying to fix something that was broken from the very beginning. What do you think about this story? Let me know in the comments, drop a like, and don't forget to subscribe for more real-life stories.